Hi, my name is Dale Mazzarella. I'm a Fly Fishers International Master Casting Instructor, a longtime Wyoming fishing guide, and an award-winning coach and educator. I've put together this video series that I hope will help you become a better fisherman, catch a lot more fish, and I hope you enjoy it. So enjoy yourself, have a good time, and let me know what you think. Let's talk about streamer rigs. During the summer of 2018, we're going to be doing quite a few videos on, fly selection, how to get your fly down, retrieves, hooks, hook sets, that kind of stuff. But right now, all we're going to be dealing with is fundamentally, how do you rig a bunch of streamers up, or at least one streamer or two streamers. And there's a lot of different ways. You may find other people who do it different ways. This is something that I've been doing for a long time. I've had a lot of success with it. I've fished with other people who have used different rigs. And to tell you the truth, this is just a pretty fundamental, basic rigging system that works pretty well in almost all conditions. So we're going to stick with this. Let's first off talk about some of the equipment. If you're going to throw streamers, and it depends, you can throw a streamer on a 3-weight rod if it's a small little streamer that's got no weight on it or very little weight on it, and you want to just throw it and it's going to be close to the surface, that's not a problem. If you're going to throw big streamers in big situations, I just got through fishing for stripers in Texas, and we were throwing 9-weight rods, stiff non-weight rods, with heavy big flies, 8, 9, 10 inches long flies, 500 grain sink tip lines. You better have a pretty stout rod to be able to do that. Even then it was pretty hard. That whole system should have been on a 10-weight rod. It made it a lot easier. In any case, so there's a big variety of the weight, the size, the types of lines you use and all that. We're going to go through some of that. But just remember that a streamer doesn't have to be a big thing, but it doesn't have to be a small thing either. I've used streamers that are 9 or 10 inches long, so they can be anywhere in between in terms of weight. They can have a lot of weight and no weight. So the rod, though, is almost always going to be a stiffer kind of rod, stiffer or faster rod, unless you're fishing with smaller streamers. Floating lines, I use floating lines quite a bit. For instance, in Tampa Bay, I use a floating line because I use it in 4 or 5 feet of water for spotted sea trout. I like to jig that. Every time you pull that line, it pulls the fly up, and as soon as you stop, the fly dives. You pull it, the fly dives. You pull it, the fly dives. It looks like a bait fish that's going in and out of or a shrimp or whatever, that's going in and out of the grass. So floating lines are good if you want to fish in shallow water. If you want to jig a fly, they're not good if you need a fly to go this way in deeper water. It's not going to happen, because every time, if it's parallel to the bottom of the river or the lake or whatever, every time you pull that fly line, you strip, that thing's going up. So then you're going to have to use some kind of a sinking line. But a floating line has a lot of purposes. Really shallow riffles, for instance, shallow tail outs. Places where you've only got a couple of inches of water depth, you may well want to use a floating line. Sinking lines, there's all kinds of sinking lines, and we've got a bunch of videos on different sinking lines, normal lines, and so on. Sinking lines can be 5 feet, just a 5-foot tip section that hardly sinks at all the way up to a full sinking line that sinks at 9 inches a second, or even faster. So sinking lines are used, and we're going to get into that more this summer about which line to use when. But anyway, you should understand that you might want to use all kinds of different lines, all kinds of different leader configurations. Leaders, a sinking line, oftentimes I use a 4-foot leader. That's all I use. On a dry fly line, a floating line, oftentimes I'll use a 9 or a 10. There's times in Tampa Bay I use a 14 or a 15-foot leader to throw clousers because the fish are so spooky. So it just depends. All that stuff depends. What I think happens, though, is a lot of people just hook on a streamer and start stripping it. And good streamer fishing is considerably more complex than just hooking on a streamer and stripping it away on the same line, the same leader, the same everything, always the same. And all you're doing is changing the fly. The fly is probably, in many instances, the fly is the least important consideration in the whole process. So leaders, we talked about that, 4 to 18 feet. How strong the leader ought to be, depends on what you're fishing for. If you're fishing, there could be leaders that you make leaders out of monofilament, you make leaders out of fluorocarbon, you make leaders out of wire even for some toothy stuff. You're fishing for different kinds of toothy fish in saltwater. You may want a wire leader. Barracuda, Spanish mackerel. A lot of people fish with those with wire leaders. The advantages in streamer fishing, the advantages of fluorocarbon are that it doesn't stretch. So when you hit a fish, that's instantaneously going to penetrate the mouth. If you have monofilament and you've got a long leader with monofilament, you may well have so much stretch. Monofilament may stretch 10%. So if you've got a 10-foot leader, it's going to stretch a foot before it finally comes to the end of that stretch and penetrates. But there are some disadvantages of fluoro too, in that it doesn't tie quite as good in knots, and it's super expensive. So there's a lot of times you can get by with monofilament. Look at the leader section, and I think you'll get some ideas about what you're going to do with leaders. Knot strength is kind of a consideration. One problem I have with fluorocarbon, and I think that while we're talking about fluorocarbon, the biggest advantage of fluorocarbon is that it's abrasion resistance. When I'm fishing under docks and I've got to worry about mussels and oysters and my fish running no leaders across that, or even a snook where you've got a really sharp gill plate, tarpon where you've got sharp scales, you're going to want at least the end of your situation to be some kind of fluorocarbon because it's going to resist abrasion. But abrasion, the one thing about fluorocarbon that people talk about is the fact that it's invisible, and it's not invisible. I mean, I can see fluorocarbon in the water. It's less visible, that's for sure, and under some light conditions it may be virtually invisible, but fish can see it, I'm sure. I mean, I've pulled tiny, tiny little flies out of fish. I mean, tiny. We're talking about baby shrimp that are literally the size of a head of a pin, and there's hundreds of them inside of a fish's stomach. So that whole thing is just nonsense. It does sink a little faster, it doesn't stretch, and it's abrasion resistance. Those are the two biggest reasons you want to use it. But in a lot of cases, that's not important, so consider that. So let's talk about the easiest, the most simple streamer situation you can have, and that's a single fly. Here I've got a single fly. Play like this one's not on here. You got a single fly at the end of your leader. That's it. The knot I usually use is a non-slip loop knot because it's super strong. It allows the fly to move a little bit, although I'm not totally convinced that's an important consideration because when you've got it under tension, that knot is tight anyway, even the loop is tight. But the point is, this is a pretty simple system. You can adjust the weight of this system. I oftentimes fish a single fly, and I'll put a weight right here, just a BB right there if I want to tie. Let's say I'm not sure. I go out to the flats and there's water anywhere between 12 inches deep and 4 feet deep, and there may be redfish or snook or something in that kind of water. I may use an unweighted fly. So I can fish in a 12-inch water, and then when I get to a little drop-off and I want to add weight, instead of changing flies, I'll just put a piece of split shot on it. So I often put the split shot right in front of this knot, and it never seems to bother anything. If you don't like that, you can certainly put your split shot farther up, but you can adjust the depth of the fly by things other than the weight of the fly. So you can put split shot on here. It's a simple system. It's easy to cast, or easier to cast depending on the weight of it. It's way less likely to tangle because obviously there's nothing else here to tangle. So that's the simplest of all the systems. Just tie on a streamer to a nail knot, or not a nail knot, a non-slip loop knot, and you're ready to go. Then you just adjust your leader length to the situation. Deeper water, slower water, faster water, how you want it to retrieve. If you've got you're going to either jig it up and down like we talked about, or straight across, or have it dive, or do all kinds of different things. Remember, if you put a weight on here and you pull it, well, especially with a floating line, you pull it with a floating line, as soon as you let go, that weight dives that fly. If you don't put a weight on it and it's weightless, then that fly is going to pretty much go this way. It might come up, but then when you stop retrieving, it's just going to kind of settle. It won't dive. So it depends on what you want, and you should understand the kind of bait that you're trying to work at. Try to observe, try to see, try to do all kinds of different things, even with a single weight, a single rig, to be able to do this. So let's talk about double rig. Double rigs, I've got a lot of double rig systems that I use. Basically, I tie off a surgeon's knot, and I tie one on the tag end of the surgeon knot here, and then at the end. And you can adjust this. You can, as you cut more flies off of here, you can add another piece of tippet on here and stick it out to here, and you can stick this one, you know, way down here. So you can adjust the length between the two. This is about what I usually use, maybe a little bit longer between the bottom fly and the top fly there. I might use a little bit more, but the advantage of this, and I love this system, it's probably by far the most common way that I fish streamers. And the reason I use it is because I have found a lot of times when I'm using a single streamer, I don't get any hits. I'll get a couple follows, but no hits. I put on a double streamer, and all of a sudden I start catching fish. And what's really ironic, my most common form, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but my most common setup is I put a big fly in the back and a little fly in the front. So this big guy is chasing that little guy. And what I've seen is, I'll bet you at least 60% of the time, the fish in situations where they're not really feeding, in terms of they're not super hungry and they're not eating single flies, they'll go right past the big fly and smash the small fly. I see that at least 60% of the time. And I'm sure the reason is, it's kind of like when you're watching a couple of kids in a nursery. Nobody wants to play with a fire truck until one kid wants to play with a fire truck, and then everybody wants to play with the fire truck. And there's a big fight over the fire truck. I think it's the same thing with fish. The fact that one fish is chasing another fish elicits a response. It's sort of a primitive instinct. Hey, you're not going to let that big guy get that. I'm going to go eat it. And I think that's what happens. Now, you can adjust this fly a lot. If you put this fly, let's say you put this fly as super heavy, and I'm assuming now we're on a sink tip line, so the line is being pulled fairly level. It's not being jigged up. It's here. If this fly is heavy, the second you strip and you stop for a second, this fly sinks. And this fly sinks much slower. So now when you retrieve, what happens, because this is all the leader right here, this is the leader. When you retrieve, what happens is, this fly is going to go, this fly starts first and this fly kind of follows up. It almost looks like this guy's chasing it, but you can turn it around. One of my favorite ways is I put a really super heavy small fly on the front. Heavy small fly on the front and a light fly in the back. Now what happens, I'm stripping, I start stripping, this thing sinks like it's running. And then this guy will float down towards it like it's looking. And then when I strip again, all of a sudden this guy comes out of the grass or off the bottom and this guy chases it. But you need to experiment with different sorts of rigging, because there may be times when fish don't eat a particular rigging. I have it a lot of times where they won't eat a big fly in the back or a small fly, but if I switch it around and I put a big fly in the front and a little fly in the back, this is a pretty common system a lot of people use. I don't use it as much. This small fly can be tiny. It can be a nymph. And then you got a big fly in the front, which gets their attention, and they follow it along and they eat the little fly. So the way the fly is acting, whether it's going up or down, or one's chasing the other one up or one's chasing the other one down, or if it's a big fly in the front and a little one in the back, or a big one in the back and a little one in the front, man, there's about 10 different combinations, and there's a lot of days where one of those combinations is going to work more than the other ones. So give all those things a shot. Remember, you don't need to strip all your streamers. A streamer under an indicator is often very effective, or a streamer just on a tighter line with barely any movement at all, just kind of keeping contact between the streamer and the rod tip. And we're going to talk about that this summer. But those can be really very, very successful tactics when you're trying to catch fish. You know, remember that when you put a sink tip line on a, let's say you have a really heavy sink tip line. You got a sink tip line, it's sinking at 9 inches a second, it's going down. If you put a light fly behind it, or a light couple of flies, now the line is down here, the flies are sinking much slower than the tungsten line. When you retrieve, what happens to those flies? They dive. So you retrieve that fly, that sinking line pulls those flies down. Let's say you do it the other way around. You put a light or sinking line, let's say 4 inches a second or 3 inches a second, and it's sinking this rate, and you put 2 heavy flies on the end of it, those heavy flies are down here. So those heavy flies are down, and then what happens when you pull it? Those flies come up. So again, you may want to change the weight of your flies depending on what happens. If you're trying 2 pretty light flies and you've got a heavy sink tip line and it's pulling and those flies are diving and you get nothing, you may want to turn it around and have it do it this way. So you can adjust which way those flies are moving based on the kind of line you have, the length of the leader, and also the weight of the flies. You could have different riggings with one fly heavy, the other fly light, vice versa, both of them light, both of them heavy. You're going to get different kinds of motions on the part of that fish or whatever it is you're trying. It could be a crawfish, it could be a leech. There's a lot of stuff in the water that other than bait fish that fish will eat. And the more you can mimic that, the better you're going to be. Dragonfly nymphs in lakes, dragonfly nymphs do this. And they just kind of go along. Damselfly nymphs sort of swim along. Those are all flies that would probably be better used this way, just level, instead of jigging up and down. Although certainly you can catch them jigging up and down. Jigs have been pretty popular for, I don't know, probably a couple 100 years. So consider doing some jigging, and that's going to be with a floating line for the most part.